The evening air was heavy with that particular chill Connecticut is known for in early spring, when the sun disappears too quickly and the nights feel longer than they should. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders as I stepped out of the car. Through the tall hedges and manicured driveway lights, Corvina's mansion rose ahead of me, glowing like some timeless palace. Marble steps gleamed under the porch lamps, and the windows spilled out golden light as if the house itself were on stage. I was late, though not by much. It had taken me longer to leave work than I planned, and traffic into Greenwich never forgave tardiness. Inside, I could already hear the hum of laughter, the kind that mixes polished charm with unspoken judgment. As I walked up the stone steps, I braced myself. The butler opened the door with his usual stiffness, and the scent of polished wood and roasted meat spilled out to meet me. The foyer was immaculate. Portraits of ancestors I'd never met stared down at me with those cold, painted eyes. The chandelier above sparkled in perfect balance, and every tile on the marble floor gleamed as if someone had scrubbed them twice just for tonight. I handed my coat to the attendant, catching my own reflection in the tall mirror. Black blouse, simple skirt, hair in a low bun, conservative, understated. I looked like someone determined not to be noticed, though part of me wondered if that was exactly why they always overlooked me. The sound of voices grew louder as I crossed toward the dining hall. When I stepped through the doorway, all eyes flicked toward me for a brief moment. The long dining table stretched the length of the room, candles burning in tall holders, silver catching the light like a photograph from a lifestyle magazine. My mother-in-law, Corvina, sat at the head, poised like a queen. My husband, Alaric, sat to her right, his shoulders tense. Sonara, my sister-in-law, wore a silk dress the color of emerald, hair styled like she was ready for a photo shoot. Lazara, the youngest, tapped at her phone until Corvina shot her a look sharp enough to make her drop it. Emmerich, my father-in-law, sat quietly, as he always did, eyes sunk into a face carved by silence. The chatter picked up again when I walked in, though the undercurrent remained. I've learned that in families like this, words don't always matter. Placement does. Who sits closest? Who speaks loudest? Who dares interrupt the matriarch? In every family, I once read, there's always someone who decides where you sit, literally and metaphorically. In this family, Corvina always decided. The server motioned me toward my seat. I already knew where it would be. Tonight, like so many nights before, I was ushered to the far end of the table, near the doors that swung open to the kitchen. From there, I could hear the clatter of plates and the hiss of pans, but not the central conversation. Corvina smiled as if this were a kindness. "It's quieter there, dear," she said smoothly, her voice carrying more power than the chandelier above us. I sat down, smoothing my skirt, glancing at Alaric. His eyes darted toward me, then down to his plate, silent. That silence stung sharper than any word. It was the kind of silence that said, "I won't defend you, not here." The clinking of silverware filled the space. Sonara leaned toward her mother, laughing too loudly at some remark. Lazara threw her head back in agreement, playing her role as the youngest darling. I watched from my corner, the distance between us more than physical. It was calculated. A server approached, pouring water into my glass. He hesitated, eyes scanning me up and down. Then he asked, almost casually, "Are you part of the staff?" The words landed like a slap. The table broke into stifled laughter, some covering their mouths with napkins, others exchanging knowing looks. Even Lazara smirked before pretending to sip her wine. Corvina did nothing. She didn't correct him, didn't defend me. Instead, she let the humiliation hang there in the air like smoke. Her smirk was faint, but deliberate. I felt the burn of their eyes, the heat of their chuckles, but I refused to flinch. I turned to the server and said evenly, "No, but thank you for asking. At least you thought I belonged here in some capacity." My voice was calm, polite, but edged. The server flushed, muttered an apology, and hurried away. The laughter softened into awkward coughs, but Corvina lifted her glass, studying me with eyes that sparkled like cut glass. She thrived on moments like this. Inside, though, I thought of boardrooms I'd sat in, rooms where billion-dollar frauds unraveled, where men in suits lied through smiles. This dinner, with its chandelier light and sparkling wine, felt just as staged, just as false. In America, being mistaken for the help isn't just a mix-up, it's a class dismissal. It says, you don't belong at this table. You are here to serve, not to speak. Tonight, they made sure I understood that. I sat straighter, forcing a smile across my face, as if their cruelty slid past me. But deep inside, I stored it, each word, each smirk, like evidence on a ledger. My eyes flicked down the table, remembering past gatherings. Birthdays where my seat was mysteriously misplaced. Christmas dinners where my name wasn't written on the place cards. I'd been erased in little ways, piece by piece. Tonight was no different. Humiliation is sharp, but it dulls when repeated. What cut deepest wasn't their laughter, it was the reminder of what I'd lost. My miscarriage wasn't spoken of tonight, but it lingered in every sidelong glance, every unspoken judgment. They saw me not as a woman, not as a wife, but as an absence. They say grief is invisible, I murmured to myself, swirling the water in my glass. But humiliation makes it public. Corvina caught my eye, her lips curving into something halfway between a smile and a challenge. She expected me to break, to lash out, or to shrink. Instead, I lifted my glass slowly, smiled faintly, and said nothing. The silence that followed unsettled them more than my words ever could. The first course had just been cleared when Corvina lifted her glass. The room settled with that obedient hush that always seemed to follow her lead. Crystal chimed faintly as others mirrored her, waiting. I already felt my stomach nodding, not from the food, but from the way her eyes lingered on me as if I were about to be the subject of her toast. To legacy, she began, voice rich and commanding, like a sermon. To the strength of this family, and to the generations that will carry our name forward. There it was. The words, carry our name, floated across the room like smoke, heavy, deliberate. My seat near the end of the table might as well have been a spotlight, because I could feel everyone's gaze sliding my way. Sinara smirked into her glass. Lazara glanced at me with the careless curiosity of someone waiting for a reaction, and Alaric, my husband, kept his eyes fixed on the tablecloth as though there was something urgent stitched into the weave. A ripple of chuckles passed down the table, not outright laughter, but that knowing kind of sound that comes when everyone shares the same cruel joke. The champagne glittered in their glasses, but I couldn't bring mine to my lips. In America, I thought bitterly, family dinners are where truths are thrown like knives, but dressed up in silverware. I braced myself. I knew the cut was coming, and when it did, it was sharper than I imagined. Corvina lowered her glass slightly, fixing me with her calculated smile. Maybe if you were stronger, she said, almost casually, we'd have had a grandchild by now. The words hit with a silence so deep I could hear the faint hum of the chandelier overhead. Then, as if on cue, awkward laughter trickled through the room. Some looked away, embarrassed, but not enough to stop them from enjoying the sting on my behalf. My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat. I pressed my palms against my knees under the table, grounding myself so I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Alaric still said nothing. He kept his head bent, eyes locked on the edge of his plate, his jaw tense but unmoving. His silence burned worse than her words. At least her cruelty was honest. His refusal to speak was a betrayal dressed as neutrality. Memories I had buried clawed their way back into me. The sterile smell of the hospital room, the flat tone of the monitor when the heartbeat stopped, the doctor's voice quiet, clinical, while I sat numb, clutching a future that was gone before it began, and Alaric's hand in mine, limp, unable to find words even then. I hadn't just lost a child that day. I lost the chance to be seen as whole in this family. To them, my worth had been measured, weighed, and found empty. Tonight, Corvina made sure everyone at this table remembered it. Grief is private, I thought, but humiliation makes it public property. The laughter died down, replaced by a few sympathetic looks that carried no real sympathy. That was when Sinara leaned forward, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine tone people use when they want to sound kind but cut deeper. It's God's plan, honey, she said, laying her manicured hand briefly on mine before pulling it away as if my skin might burn her. Some women just aren't meant to be mothers. The words rolled out like a lullaby, but each syllable dug like a blade. Around the table, heads nodded as if she'd spoken some profound truth. Lazara tilted her head, pitying, but her eyes sparkled with amusement. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. How often people cloak cruelty in the robes of faith, turning belief into a shield for their malice. In America, I'd seen this trick too many times. Judgment disguised as piety, dismissal wrapped in scripture. It was always socially acceptable to wound if you signed God's name at the bottom of it. I sipped my water slowly, letting the silence between gulps serve as my answer. To cry would be to give them the theater they craved. To argue would only confirm that they had struck true. Instead, I let the moment hang, my calm unsettling them more than anger could. Across the table, Corvina's lips curved into satisfaction. Sinara leaned back, smug, convinced she had delivered wisdom. Alaric's shoulders sagged further, weighed down by his cowardice, and my father-in-law, Emmerich, glanced at me for half a second before lowering his eyes, his silence just another stone on the pile. Inside, my thoughts were a storm. I felt the sting, the shame, but beneath it all there was something else. Calculation. Silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Every word they hurled tonight, every smirk, every false comfort, I was recording it all in the quiet of my mind. Never wrestle with pigs, I reminded myself, recalling George Bernard Shaw's words. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. I straightened in my chair, posture deliberate. If they wanted me to shrink, I would rise taller. If they wanted my tears, I would give them my calm. The room began to shift. My composure contrasted their cruelty, and in that contrast, their laughter began to sound less like victory and more like pettiness. I raised my glass slightly, not to toast, not to drink, but simply to remind them I was still here, unbroken. The room fell quieter. Even Corvina's eyes flickered, just for a second, uncertain why her cut hadn't drawn blood. I smiled faintly, lips barely curved, and said nothing. The plates were being set down again, the main course arriving with a flourish from the kitchen staff. Silver covers were lifted, aromas of seasoned lamb and roasted vegetables filling the air. The conversation swelled back to life, laughter ringing at the upper half of the table where the family clustered closest to Corvina. From my seat at the end, I felt like I was watching a play I hadn't been cast in. Corvina set down her wine glass, her voice rising above the chatter. She didn't need to raise it much. Everybody naturally leaned toward her. She folded her hands delicately, like a judge about to deliver a verdict. Some women, she began, eyes sweeping the table but finally settling on me, just aren't meant to be mothers. The words carried a strange weight, delivered with the rhythm of wisdom. For a moment, there was silence. Then heads nodded, as if she had spoken an eternal truth, something written in scripture or carved into stone. I saw Sinara murmur an agreement under her breath, Lazara smile into her napkin. My fork slipped slightly in my grip. The room blurred for an instant, and I forced myself to breathe. It's one thing to lose a child, it's another to have that loss paraded like a family anecdote, transformed into dinner entertainment. I gripped the utensil tighter, grounding myself, holding back the urge to throw it down. Silence became my shield again. I refused to give her the theater she wanted. Survival tonight meant letting her believe her words had landed without effect. Still, the sting spread through me. My miscarriage had been many things, private, painful, something I had carried in the quiet corners of my heart. And now, in the glow of chandelier light, it had become public property, rebranded as my identity. Not Myrelle the wife, not Myrelle the professional, but Myrelle the woman who couldn't keep a child alive. The laughter continued around the table, soft and complicit, until Lazara let hers slip out louder than intended. She grinned, tossing her hair back, and said brightly, "Well, at least it saved us from more medical bills." The remark detonated in the middle of the table. Sinara quickly pressed her napkin to her lips, pretending to cough, but unable to hide her smile. A few others chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or condemn. None chose condemnation. My heart lurched, but outwardly, I stayed still. Alaric stiffened beside his mother, his jaw clenching. But still he kept his eyes down. His silence stung again, a blade deeper than their barbs. I thought, I'm not just invisible, I'm a punchline. Humor is a cruel weapon in American families. People laugh because it's easier than facing the cruelty underneath. Jokes become shields. If it's said in jest, it's excusable. And when people laugh, it confirms to the speaker that the cruelty was deserved. The sound of their amusement rang in my ears. I reminded myself, every word said tonight was being recorded, not on paper, not in ink, but in my memory. Even if no one else cared, I did. And I was collecting each syllable like evidence, storing them for the day silence would give way to something sharper. As they went back to eating, my mind slipped to the past, dragged unwillingly by the rawness of the wound. I was back in that hospital room. The smell of antiseptic, the fluorescent lights too harsh, the air too still. I remembered how the monitor's beeping had slowed, then flattened. The doctor's voice low and professional, but hollow. I'm sorry. My body numb, tears refusing to come because I was already emptied out. Alaric had been there, hand in mine, but words never came from him. He never spoke about it again afterward. Not once did he ask how I carried the loss. Not once did he sit with me in the stillness of grief. His silence stretched weeks into months until it became the default language between us. Days later, Corvina sent flowers. Bright, expensive roses, delivered in a tall glass vase. The card was tucked in, with handwriting I recognized immediately. Better luck next time. That card cut sharper than any thorn on those stems. I still saw it when I closed my eyes. I still felt the mockery in its brevity, its dismissal of something that had broken me to pieces. I learned that grief is solitary. You can bleed in the open, and no one will hand you a bandage. In this family, my grief had never belonged to me. It was rebranded as weakness, used as a weapon against me. Maya Angelou's words echoed in my mind. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. Corvina had shown me long ago, and tonight was only confirmation. The table bustled with conversation again, my pain buried under their chatter about investments, vacations, trivial anecdotes. I sat straighter, chest aching but composure firm. I refused to give them tears. Instead, I adjusted my posture, laid my fork gently on the plate, and drew a deep, quiet breath. Every word they hurled, every smirk they exchanged, I stored in silence. Not because I was defeated, but because silence was the pause before thunder. They thought I was finished. They didn't realize I was preparing. I tilted my head upward, staring at the chandelier as their words echoed without answer, letting them believe they'd won while I planned my next move in the quiet of my mind. The main course lay half-eaten on my plate, the lamb cooling beside roasted carrots and potatoes I had barely touched. The room buzzed with conversation, forks striking porcelain, wine glasses lifted in casual arrogance. From where I sat, the glow of the chandeliers made the entire scene feel theatrical, as though this weren't a family meal at all, but a tribunal convened to pronounce judgment. Corvina dabbed her mouth delicately with a linen napkin before speaking. Her voice was soft, but it carried easily over the noise. "This house," she said, pausing so her words spread like smoke, "belongs to my son's bloodline, not you." The sentence struck like a gavel. For a moment, even the staff froze mid-step, trays balanced in mid-air. The room held its breath, my fork hovered above the plate, hand trembling beneath the tablecloth. To them, it may have been a simple declaration. To me, it was erasure. She wasn't only telling me I didn't belong in the house, she was making it clear that I didn't belong in the family. The estate wasn't walls and ceilings, it was a symbol of power, of legitimacy, and I had just been disowned from it in front of everyone. I scanned the faces around the table. Sinara's smile was small but gleaming, as if she'd been waiting for the words to drop. Lazara hid a grin behind her hand, poorly disguising her satisfaction. Emmerich, the patriarch in name only, stared down into his wine. And Alaric, my husband, looked as though he'd swallowed glass. His lips parted, but nothing came out. His silence again became its own betrayal. My internal voice was steady, though my pulse thundered in my ears. I wasn't just losing a roof, I was being erased. The table began to breathe again, and then Lazara leaned forward, her lips curving into a smile that carried the cruelty of youth unchecked. "Guess we'll turn your room into a nursery," she said brightly, "for someone who can actually give us a baby." The laughter erupted, some muffled, some loud. The sound cascaded down the table like water over stone. Alaric flinched, his fork clattering against his plate, but again he said nothing. His silence roared louder than their mockery. I looked at them, at the gleaming jewelry on Sonara's wrists, at Lazara's sparkling dress, at the smugness settling over Corvina's features. None of this was random. Their cruelty was strategy. By labeling me as replaceable, they reinforced the hierarchy. They reminded each other, and me, that my worth was bound to the children I could not bear. They think children are currency, I thought bitterly. That makes me bankrupt in their eyes. I knew this wasn't just personal malice, it was cultural. In America, women past 30 are asked constantly when they will marry, when they will have children, as though time itself is a countdown to worth. Tonight, those cultural expectations had been sharpened into weapons, and I was the target. My chest burned, humiliation flaring like fire under my skin. But outwardly, I did nothing. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip of water, and let the silence hang between us. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to cry, to storm out, to confirm their judgment. I would not give them that victory. I set my glass down gently, locking eyes with Corvina. My lips didn't move, but my stare held steady. She tilted her chin, clearly unsettled by my refusal to bend. Inside, the war raged. I thought about standing up, about leaving this table forever, walking out the door without a backward glance. But I knew better. Walking out now would be surrender. It would mean handing them the final word, validating their cruelty. No, if I left tonight, it would not be in silence. It would be on my terms. I remembered something I had once read. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, "I will try again tomorrow." My silence was not weakness. It was control. And tonight, control was my only weapon. I cut another small piece of lamb, moved it around my plate, and continued to watch them. Every barb they threw, every laugh they shared, was another shovel digging their own grave. They thought they were burying me, but I knew better. The deeper they dug, the harder it would be to climb out when the truth surfaced. My gaze traveled down the table, past the ornate centerpieces, past the rows of polished silverware, past the glasses brimming with red wine. This wasn't dinner. This was a spectacle, a courtroom with Corvina as judge and executioner. And I was the defendant, silently gathering evidence with every breath. I looked at my plate, food untouched. The flavors of the evening no longer mattered. This wasn't about lamb or wine or dessert. It was about exile. They were stripping me of my seat at the table, stripping me of belonging, stripping me of identity. I reminded myself, in wealthy households, meals are rarely just meals. They are trials. Who speaks, who interrupts, who stays silent, every action is a ruling. Tonight, the verdict was clear. I was not one of them. But as the laughter subsided, as napkins were dabbed at painted lips and wine glasses tilted in satisfaction, I made my own quiet decision. My silence tonight wasn't fear. It was preparation. Every insult, every dismissal, every calculated smirk, I gathered them like rope in my hands. Rope that would one day tighten, not around me, but around them. I folded my napkin slowly, laying it neatly beside my plate. Then I lifted my head, locked eyes with Corvina, and didn't blink. For the first time that night, she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The lamb was nearly gone from most plates, forks scraping porcelain as the staff hovered at the edges of the dining hall ready to clear the dishes. I had barely touched mine. It sat cooling on the plate, meat turning dull under the glow of the chandeliers. The laughter around me carried on, rising and falling like waves, but I kept my hands steady in my lap. I had endured insult after insult, each one sharper than the last. Yet I made a choice then, not to answer, not to argue, not to let them see what boiled under my skin. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, spine straight, expression unreadable. I reminded myself of something I had once read. In America, people expect quick defense, raised voices, the kind of confrontation that makes for spectacle. But sometimes, the strongest defense is stillness. I lifted my water glass and sipped, watching their faces shift. Corvina's eyes darted toward me again and again, waiting for cracks in my composure. The fact that I gave her none made her fidget slightly, the napkin twisting in her fingers though she smiled through it. I felt like a bow pulled back, tension stored and waiting, but invisible to anyone who didn't know how close to breaking the string could be. My silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. I let my gaze travel slowly around the table. Sinara leaned close to Lazara, the two whispering with smiles that weren't hard to interpret. Their amusement was obvious, their glances sliding my way as if I were deaf as well as mute. They thought they were clever, performing cruelty like it was comedy. Emmerich, my father-in-law, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His knife and fork moved slower, his shoulders curling inward. He never defended me, but I saw the shame flicker across his face. Shame, though, without courage, was worth nothing. Alaric sat rigid, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch near his temple. He didn't dare raise his voice against his mother, and that silence betrayed me more than any of their words. His paralysis was another wound, another reminder that I stood alone at this table. I thought of politics, of governments. Families weren't so different. Tyrants survived not just because they ruled, but because others stayed silent. Tonight, I was watching that dynamic play out in real time. Power flowed from Corvina outward, like a current that froze everyone else into complicity. I placed my glass back down with deliberate calm, making the action slow, letting it echo. For all their noise, my composure unsettled them. It was the one thing they couldn't control. As I shifted slightly in my chair, something caught the corner of my eye. Above the archway at the far end of the room, a tiny red light blinked in rhythm. I blinked too, realizing what it was. The security cameras. It hit me all at once. Every word said tonight, every barb, every humiliating laugh was being recorded. Not only by me in memory, but by the unblinking eye fixed on this room. My lips curved faintly, the first real smile I had allowed myself all evening. They think their words vanish into the air, I thought. They don't realize walls remember. The satisfaction that filled me then wasn't joy. It was quiet recognition that arrogance often provides its own noose. Evidence doesn't always have to be hunted down. Sometimes it sits openly, waiting for the right person to notice. I leaned back, my hand resting lightly on my lap. Calm, still. But inside, a ledger was growing, each insult logged, each moment preserved, each laugh waiting for replay. I told myself not to rush, not to give away that I had noticed. Let them continue. Let them hand me more rope with which to bind their future. Conversation grew again, shifting to trivialities, vacations planned. Real estate bragged about. Lazara described a dress she had bought in Milan, while Sinara pretended to be impressed. The arrogance was endless, as if cruelty could be softened by expensive taste. And through it all, the little red light blinked on. Steady, patient, recording. I felt the air shift around me. They thought my silence meant defeat, but I could see their unease growing. Every second I refused to react, forced them to question themselves. People like Corvina thrived on scenes, on tears and raised voices. When denied that, they faltered. I sat taller, my back pressing against the carved wood of the chair. The posture itself became a statement. My presence, unbent, unbroken, weighed heavier than any response. Speak only if it improves upon the silence, Gandhi had once said. Tonight, nothing they deserved could improve upon mine. My silence was louder than their jeers, sharper than their staged laughter. I looked once more at the blinking red light before returning my gaze to Corvina. She caught my eye, and for the first time that night, I smiled faintly, calm and deliberate. Her lips twitched, just slightly. And in that twitch, I saw it, the realization that her power was no longer absolute. The sound of forks clinking and voices overlapping filled the long dining hall. By now, the wine had loosened tongues, and the mood had turned sharper, more brazen. Conversations carried an edge, a hostility thinly disguised as laughter. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, letting the storm swirl around me while I absorbed each word. Sinara leaned forward, her eyes locked on me as though the table wasn't wide enough to keep her venom at bay. "Some women," she said with a little shrug, "bring nothing but drama." The words rippled through the room, not in shock but in agreement. Lazara burst into laughter, tossing her hair as if she had just heard the funniest joke of the evening. "She's right," she chimed in. "Always making a scene, always the problem." My husband sat motionless. Alaric's eyes stayed glued to his plate, his fork moving food around without lifting it to his mouth. Not once did he look at me. His silence was worse than their mockery. It was an abandonment dressed as restraint, a betrayal cloaked in neutrality. I thought, it's one thing to be attacked, it's another to be abandoned by the one person who should stand beside you. I let my gaze pass slowly over the table. The faces told me everything, who smirked, who whispered, who stayed silent. American families often fracture not in words, but in who dares to speak or who doesn't. Tonight, the fractures ran deep. A cough sounded from the far end of the table. Emmerich, my father-in-law, cleared his throat. His hands trembled slightly as he set his glass down. For once, he looked at me, his face stricken, then back to his wife. "Enough," he said softly but firmly. "She doesn't deserve this." His voice was cut like a knife. "Don't defend weakness," Corvina snapped, her tone as cold as the marble beneath our feet. "It makes you look just as weak." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emmerich's face collapsed, his shoulders folding inward as though he had been struck. In front of his children, his grandchildren, and the extended family, he shrank back into submission. I watched him carefully. The courage had been there. I could see it, but it had been crushed beneath decades of Corvina's dominance. His lips pressed shut. He didn't dare continue. It struck me deeply. Even men who carried the title of patriarch could be silenced when tyranny ruled the table. In countless homes across America, fathers had retreated into silence, surrendering the throne to domineering spouses. Emmerich was no different. My heart ached with disappointment, but there was clarity too. I was completely alone in this war. There would be no allies here. Yet even as the fire burned inside me, I remained still. I refused to join their shouting. My silence became a heavier presence than their noise, a shield they could not penetrate. Every cruel phrase tonight, every nod of agreement, every laugh, it all revealed them. Celebrations never expose true character, but conflict does, and tonight, every mask slipped. I watched them more closely than ever. Sinara's eyes glittered with malice. Lazara's giggles carried the shallowness of someone who had never faced consequences. Corvina sat high-backed, self-assured, certain of her control. Alaric, my husband, the man who had promised to protect me, could not summon the strength to look me in the eye. And in that silence, I knew the truth. I didn't need them to defend me. I only needed them to keep talking. Every word they spoke was another stone stacked against them, another record of their cruelty. I straightened in my chair, my spine tall, my posture deliberate. I lifted my chin and let my eyes travel, one by one, to each person around the table. I did not say a word, but my gaze forced them to look back at themselves. It worked. Lazara shifted in her seat, her giggles faltering. Sinara's smirk weakened. Even Corvina, so assured in her dominance, pursed her lips, unsettled by the silence that seemed to grow louder with each heartbeat. Oprah Winfrey once said, "Betrayal can only happen if you love." Those words echoed in my mind. Tonight proved that whatever love I had believed in within this family was conditional, and I was done meeting their conditions. I looked at Alaric one last time, but he didn't meet my gaze. My husband's silence was final confirmation of the distance that had long since grown between us. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my napkin, folded it with care, and placed it on the table. I whispered to myself, words only I could hear. "This isn't over." The words never reached them, but my silence did. It grew louder than their cruelty, louder than their false laughter, louder than their confidence. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted, not in their favor, but in mine. Dessert was being prepared in the kitchen, the scent of sugar and citrus drifting faintly into the room, but nobody at the table seemed to care. The wine had worked its way into their bloodstreams, and the conversation had shifted from casual mockery to something darker. The rhythm of the evening had changed. Laughter now felt sharper, almost rehearsed, as if cruelty itself had become entertainment. Corvina's hand moved gracefully toward the empty chair beside her at the table, a place that had remained unused all night. She gestured toward it with a smile that wasn't truly a smile at all. "This seat stays empty," she said smoothly, her gaze sliding directly to me, "just like her womb." The room froze for the smallest beat, and then came the ripple, gasps from a few, smirks from others, some who looked away as though pretending not to hear. No one corrected her. Not one voice rose to say it was too far. They let the words sit, heavy as stone, crushing in their weight. I stared at the chair, my fork pausing in midair. The symbolism was undeniable. In American households, an empty chair can be a mark of respect, a symbol of remembrance for someone lost. Tonight, that symbol had been twisted into ridicule, turned into a weapon against me. Inside, I thought, in families like this, absence is weaponized. What's missing is paraded louder than what remains. I set my fork down carefully, fingers tightening slightly around the handle before letting it go. They wanted to see me break. I refused to give them the spectacle, but the performance was far from over. Sonara stood, the emerald silk of her dress glinting under the chandelier, and produced something from a gift bag that had been waiting near the centerpiece. She placed it carefully in front of her mother, who chuckled before sliding it closer to the center of the table where all could see. It was a decorative cradle. A toy-sized replica, lacquered wood polished, complete with delicate bedding inside. The laughter rose again, sharper this time, glasses clinking as if this were some grand comedy. Corvina smirked, her words deliberate. "Some things," she said, resting her palm lightly on the cradle, "are only for real mothers." The sound of forks hitting plates followed. Some covered their mouths with napkins, muffling snickers. Lazara leaned back, tapping her wineglass with her nail like she was marking time for applause. Across the table, Alaric flinched. His eyes darted toward me, searching my face for a reaction. But again, he said nothing. He sat paralyzed, a man caught between blood and vows, unwilling to defend either. Each laugh from around the table landed like nails being driven deeper into wood. My humiliation had been elevated into spectacle, entertainment shared between siblings and in-laws who should have known better. Humiliation becomes entertainment when cruelty is allowed to be culture, I thought, the phrase repeating like a drumbeat inside me. I lifted my glass of water and took a long sip, letting the silence from my end of the table press against their noise. I would not cry. I would not storm out. Instead, I let the image of the cradle burn itself into my mind. Not defeat, evidence, proof of how far they were willing to go. Under the table, my hands trembled, but above it, my face remained unreadable. Stillness was my choice. I reminded myself, if I gave them tears, they would believe they had won. If I gave them rage, they would think themselves powerful. No, I would give them nothing. Symbols I knew could be reclaimed. What they used tonight to humiliate me could one day become their undoing. They thought themselves clever with props and chairs, but they had forgotten that the most dangerous people aren't the loudest. They are the ones who remember. I took mental snapshots. The empty chair, waiting like a stage cue. The cradle gleaming in the candlelight. The faces, each of them twisted in amusement at my expense. Every detail seared into my mind like photographs I could replay at will. My resolve hardened in that moment. Silence tonight wasn't surrender. It was an investment. Every cruel word, every mocking gesture, every staged piece of theater was adding weight to a scale. And one day soon, that scale would tip back against them. The longer they laughed, the more surreal it became. This wasn't a family dinner anymore. It was a theater of cruelty, and I was their unwilling spectacle. I thought, families who turn grief into spectacle are no families at all. I straightened in my chair, shoulders back, refusing to slouch into the role they had scripted for me. They wanted me to look small, diminished, erased. Instead, I forced my presence to grow heavier. My silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating, until even the laughter began to falter. I let my gaze settle on the cradle one last time before lifting my eyes to Corvina. Slowly, deliberately, I gave her a small smile, not wide, not mocking, but sharp enough to slice through her veneer of control. Her expression faltered, just for a second. And that second was mine. The plates of dessert had just been set down when Corvina rose from her chair. Her movement was subtle, but carried the weight of command, and instantly the room's chatter dropped. The dining hall's chandeliers glimmered off the surface of her champagne flute as she lifted it, her posture regal, her presence magnetic. Every eye turned to her, waiting for what she would say. "To the mothers of this family," she began, her tone smooth but firm, each word enunciated with deliberate clarity. "The women who carry our name forward, who safeguard our legacy, and ensure that the bloodline continues as it always has." The glass caught the light as she gestured toward Sonara, who beamed proudly, and toward Lazara, who giggled as if she had already earned her place in that legacy. Corvina's eyes lingered on each woman who had children or was celebrated for their fertility. Then her gaze came to me, just for a moment, before sliding past, as if I didn't exist at all. Applause rang out around the table, joined by the clinking of crystal, as though her words were a blessing. My heart beat hard in my chest, not from shock but from recognition. This wasn't praise. It was exclusion sharpened into ceremony. In America, toasts are meant to honor, to uplift. But tonight, Corvina's glass wasn't raised in celebration. It was raised like a sword. And though her lips curved in that practiced smile, her words cut deeper than any blade. I stayed quiet, my own glass untouched, the chill of the stem resting between my fingers. My silence wasn't weakness. It was sharpening into something deliberate, a patience that unnerved even me. Then, from further down the table, came a voice that didn't belong to blood. "So, Alaric," the guest, Varen, a business associate of the family, said with casual cruelty, his words dripping in a half-smile. "When will you find a wife who can actually give you kids?" The laughter that followed was jagged. Some chuckled, startled by his boldness. Others laughed too easily, as if the comment had been waiting in the air, unspoken but shared. My ears buzzed, heat rushing up my neck. Alaric stiffened, his face flushing crimson. His hand tightened around the stem of his glass, but he didn't speak. His lips parted, then shut again, as though the words had been strangled before they could form. He sat there, silent, letting the moment hang while the room feasted on my humiliation. My stomach twisted, but I forced my breathing to slow, steadying it until it matched the rhythm of the ticking clock on the far wall. I would not give them tears. I would not let my anger become their entertainment. Inside, I thought, this has gone beyond family dysfunction. When outsiders join the cruelty, it is no longer private. It is trial by spectacle. The sound of laughter swirled around me. I lifted my chin and raised my glass, not to drink, not to join in, but to meet Corvina's eyes deliberately. Our gazes locked across the table. She smiled faintly, but I saw the flicker beneath it, the uncertainty, the brief crack in her armor. She hadn't expected me to hold my ground this long. I didn't look away. They mistake composure for defeat, I told myself silently. But silence is not surrender. It is a fuse, waiting for its spark. I scanned the faces around me. Each laugh, each glance, each whispered aside became another weight stacked onto the scale I was holding inside. Every insult tonight was evidence, every moment another nail in the coffin of their own arrogance. I remembered the quote, "What you allow is what will continue." Tonight, I allowed nothing but silence. I refused to validate their cruelty by responding. Let them believe they were winning. It only made their fall more certain. As I lowered my glass, I noted who laughed the loudest, Lazara's high-pitched cackle, Sonara's elegant snicker, and who stayed quiet, their discomfort showing in the tightness of their jaws. Even Emmerich, who rarely spoke, shifted in his seat with unease, but as always, said nothing. The dinner had fully transformed into a circus. This was no family gathering. It was theater. Every clink of glass was a drumbeat, every smirk a spotlight, every insult a line in a script written to degrade me. But I refused the role they had scripted. My silence became oppressive, a mirror that reflected their cruelty back at them. They laughed, but the sound began to falter, as though the weight of my stillness pressed against their throats. They thought they were burying me beneath ridicule. What they didn't realize was that roots grow deeper in the dark. I lowered my glass without drinking and let my gaze sweep the table, memorizing each face. For a moment, the laughter died completely, the room falling into an uneasy quiet. Even Corvina's smirk felt strained, her power fragile in the silence. The plates of half-eaten desserts still sat before us, jeweled slices of tart and delicate crème brûlée crusted with sugar. Few touched them. Laughter had returned after Corvina's toast, but it carried a sharper pitch now, fueled by champagne and cruelty. Glasses clinked, and the air had grown thick with smugness. Corvina leaned back in her chair, savoring the power she had exercised. She swirled her champagne slowly, the golden liquid catching the chandelier's light. Then, as if rewarding her audience with a final act, she announced, "A dear friend will be joining us shortly, a man of great influence, a man who respects me deeply." The murmur around the table was immediate. Heads turned, impressed smiles spreading. Sinara whispered to Lazara, "See? Even the government bends toward her." Lazara giggled like a child, flicking her hair back as though she were already basking in that reflected power. Emmerich shifted uncomfortably, but kept silent. Alaric's face tightened, eyes dropping back to the table. He knew the weight of what she was implying, that her reach extended beyond family, into the very arms of authority. I sat motionless, my glass cool against my fingertips. Inside, my thoughts sharpened. The cruel never stop at victory. They must display power to prove it's permanent. She had already humiliated me with chairs, cradles, and toasts. Now she was raising the stakes, flaunting an ally in government as her final card. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I let the silence deepen around me, watching her weave her own trap with confidence. Then it came. A knock. It wasn't the polite tap of a guest, but a firm, resonant thud that echoed through the grand hallway like a gavel striking wood. The laughter at the table faltered. Glasses lowered. A few nervous chuckles attempted to recover the moment, but died quickly. The butler, poised and proper, froze near the double doors that led to the entryway. Even he seemed uncertain. Corvina's eyes lit up with triumph. She leaned forward, her lips curving. "That must be him," she said, almost purring the words. Chairs shifted. Family members straightened, smoothing dresses, adjusting cuffs. Lazara whispered loudly, "Finally, someone important." And Sinara smirked knowingly, as if they were about to be validated by greatness itself. The atmosphere changed in an instant. What had been arrogance turned to anticipation. They sat taller, eager to be seen in the company of this powerful man, eager to have their cruelty blessed by an outsider's presence. But inside me, a current of calm surged. They thought the evening was theirs. They didn't know the night was about to turn. The knock echoed again, deeper this time. Then came footsteps, firm and deliberate, across the polished marble of the entry hall. The heavy front door creaked, its hinges groaning under the weight of history, and the sound carried into the dining room. The chatter died completely. The room became a stage waiting for the curtain to lift. The door swung wider, every face tilted toward the entrance, breaths held, hearts drumming with expectation. They had prepared applause, prepared smiles, prepared to welcome this man of power who would confirm everything Corvina had just proclaimed. But when the figure stepped inside, it wasn't who they expected. Gasps rustled across the room. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their anticipation dissolving into confusion. Sinara's lips parted in surprise, her smugness faltering. Lazara blinked, her giggle cut short. I felt my heart pound once, hard, then steady itself. My face remained composed, calm, betraying nothing. I knew the truth was closer now. Corvina's smile wavered, but she forced it wider, trying to maintain her stage presence. She lifted her glass slightly, a gesture rehearsed to mask uncertainty. Expectation is the sharpest stage for humiliation, I thought. They prepared applause, but silence will meet them instead. The shift in the room was palpable. The smug atmosphere that had dominated all evening dissolved into suspenseful quiet. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker differently, their glow colder, harsher against the polished surfaces of the hall. This knock was no accident, no polite visit. It was the sound of cracks forming in Corvina's empire. The figure's shadow stretched long across the marble floor, creeping into the dining hall ahead of him. The air thickened. Every pair of eyes tracked the movement at the doorway. The only sound was the soft echo of shoes crossing stone. Corvina's smile was too wide now, brittle at the edges. She lifted her chin, confident, or pretending to be, that her ally had come to validate her dominance. "You'll see," she murmured under her breath, but loud enough for those closest to hear. "This is why I am who I am." I leaned back slightly in my chair, my expression calm but resolute. The illusion she had crafted all night was seconds from shattering. "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall," I recalled from Proverbs, the words ringing like prophecy inside me. They believed this night belonged to them, but pride had made them blind. The door swung open fully, the footsteps entered the hall, and shadows stretched further up the walls. Corvina, glass raised in triumph, was seconds away from realizing the man she awaited was not her ally. He was her reckoning. The footsteps echoed against the marble hallway, each strike a drumbeat drawing nearer. The laughter at the table evaporated, leaving only the clink of crystal and the shuffle of unease. I held my breath, my fingers still on the stem of my glass, my eyes fixed on the doorway. Then he appeared. Not the powerful friend Corvina had promised, not some influential figure ready to validate her cruelty. The man who stepped into the dining hall wore a crisp suit, his tie perfectly aligned, his shoes polished to a mirror's shine. In his hand, he carried a folder, and clipped to his breast pocket was the unmistakable badge of authority. His expression was stern, professional, the kind of face used to walking into rooms and silencing them without effort. The dining hall froze. Even the servers halted mid-step. "Good evening," the man said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "I'm Investigator Talbot with the Federal Bureau of Financial Investigations." The words cracked through the room like thunder. My eyes darted to Corvina. Her smile, wide and triumphant just seconds ago, faltered. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The predator, I thought, had invited the hunter into her own den. She had boasted too much, too loudly, too often. The irony burned like fire. Her greatest display of dominance had become her undoing. He moved closer to the table, pulling the folder from under his arm. "This property," he said evenly, "is under federal review for suspected financial misconduct." The room erupted, not in sound, but in restless silence. Chairs shifted, eyes darted. Guests exchanged bewildered glances. He placed the folder flat on the table, flipping it open. Page after page of documents spread across the linen, stark black and white against the glowing candles. Each page fell like a hammer striking the table. Corvina laughed, a brittle sound that cracked under its own weight. "This must be some mistake," she said. "My dear friend wouldn't allow—" "Bank records don't lie," Talbot interrupted coldly. The words cut deeper than anything I had endured that night. I didn't move. My silence held steady, heavier now with vindication. I thought, all night they demanded my humiliation. Now the truth speaks louder than any defense I could have given. Sonara's glass slipped slightly in her hand, the rim chiming against the plate. Lazara pressed her napkin to her mouth, wide-eyed. Emmerich slumped back, as if years of denial were collapsing all at once. And Alaric's head snapped toward me, then back to his mother, his face pale, realization dawning. Talbot continued, his voice unshaken. "Shell companies, offshore accounts, funds redirected from federal housing grants into personal holdings, all linked to Norwell and Finch Development." I watched Corvina's face stiffen. Her knuckles whitened around her champagne flute. "This house," Talbot added, his eyes scanning the opulent dining hall, "was purchased through laundered funds. Effective immediately, its ownership is frozen pending investigation." Emmerich whispered then, barely audible but heavy with despair. "The house. It's not even ours? The room broke into murmurs. Guests exchanged nervous looks. Some leaned toward each other, whispering sharp questions. Judgment filled the air. Sonara's carefully painted face cracked as she turned to Lazara, panic plain in her expression. Lazara's confidence vanished, her lips trembling as she stared at her mother. The humiliation had shifted. Tonight, it was Corvina who sat in the seat of shame. Truth will ultimately prevail where there is pains to bring it to light, I thought, recalling George Washington's words. Corvina tried to recover, her voice sharp, defensive. You come into my home, you accuse me in front of my family. This is outrageous. This isn't accusation, Talbot said. He tapped the documents with one finger. This is evidence. Silence engulfed the room again. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands folded calmly in my lap. My eyes met Talbot's briefly, just for a second, and there was the faintest recognition between us. Not complicity, just understanding. He knew I had seen this coming. Every humiliation I had endured tonight was now reversed. The silence I had carried, mocked as weakness, now bloomed into vindication. Sometimes, I thought, the most powerful thing you can do is let others expose themselves. Above us, the little red light of the security camera blinked, recording every second of Corvina's unraveling. Talbot pulled a chair out, sat at the table as if he had been invited, and began unfolding more files. The family held its breath. Corvina gripped her glass so tightly her hand trembled. The investigator remained seated at the head of the table as if the chair had been reserved for him all along. His folder of documents lay open, each page turned with deliberate care, the sound of paper sliding over linen louder than the clatter of silverware that had now ceased entirely. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their champagne glasses held awkwardly mid-air, no longer sure whether to drink or to wait. Corvina tried to summon her usual poise, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her. She forced a laugh, dismissive, brittle. Surely, this is nothing more than a clerical error, she said, her words carrying less weight than ever before. A man of my acquaintance in government. He'll clear this up in a moment. But her voice trembled, and for the first time, everyone at the table heard it. The investigator didn't flinch. We've traced multiple accounts, he said steadily, his tone clinical. Funds redirected through shell corporations. Offshore holdings disguised under aliases. Each transaction leads here, to this estate, to your company. The documents hit the table with a thud as he laid them down one by one. Every page was a hammer strike, building the cadence of collapse. The arrogance Corvina had worn like a crown crumbled before our eyes. She sputtered, This is absurd. Anyone could fabricate records like that. Bank records, the investigator said coldly. Don't lie. The silence was suffocating. A glass tipped over somewhere down the table, wine dripping onto the pristine cloth. No one moved to clean it. I observed her closely. For decades she had played queen, unshaken, untouchable. But arrogance never prepares for accountability. Her fortress was paper-thin, and tonight the storm had torn it apart. It takes decades to build a false empire, but only minutes to watch it collapse. Emmerich, pale and shaking, suddenly spoke. His voice was thin, raspy, but carried in the silence. The house, he whispered, it's not even ours? The words, broken and fragile, cut through the room like glass shattering. Every head turned. His eyes, glassy with despair, darted to his wife. He looked betrayed, hollowed, decades of belief crumbling in a single moment. Stop it, Corvina hissed, her veneer cracking completely. Don't embarrass yourself. But the damage was done. His question echoed across the hall, louder than any accusation. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment humiliation no longer belonged to me. It belonged to them. In America, wealth is tethered to property. The house you own defines who you are, the legacy you leave. And here, in this gilded room, the foundation of that wealth was revealed as fraud. Their identity, their pride, everything they had paraded, gone. Sonara dropped her fork, the clang startling in the silence. Lazara's face drained of color as her carefully constructed mask slipped. Their roles as perfect daughters-in-law, as heirs to a spotless dynasty, dissolved into panic. Alaric stared blankly, his eyes darting between me and his mother. For the first time, I saw realization in his face, realization that silence had not been weakness, but strength. That every moment I had endured tonight had been the gathering of power, not its loss. The guests whispered now, their murmurs sharp, judgment spilling into the air like smoke. Reputations were tarnishing in real time, the story of the evening already rewriting itself in their minds. No longer was I the spectacle, they were. I thought, public disgrace is heavier than private grief. Tonight, disgrace sat at Corvina's plate. She tried again, desperate. This is a witch hunt. My enemies are jealous. The truth, the investigator interrupted, his tone sharp, is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose. It will defend itself. The quote landed with force, silencing even her. I remained still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my expression calm. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My silence, once ridiculed, was now the loudest voice at the table. They wanted me erased. Instead, they erased themselves. The red light of the security camera blinked steadily overhead, capturing every tremor in Corvina's hands, every crack in her voice. Then it happened. Her grip on the glass tightened so hard it shattered. Wine spilled across the linen, red bleeding like blood into the fabric. No one moved. Not a servant, not a guest, not even her daughters. The sound of crystal breaking was final, irreversible. The house of cards had fallen. The room had gone still after the sound of glass breaking. Red wine seeped across the linen, spreading like blood, staining the perfect white cloth. No one dared move, not one guest or servant. The weight of the collapse sat heavy on every shoulder in that room. I rose slowly, pushing my chair back with calm precision. The scrape of its legs against the marble floor was the loudest sound in the dining hall. My eyes never left Corvina. Her knuckles were white, her hand shaking around the broken stem of her glass, but she refused to let it go. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, to reclaim control, but nothing came. I reached into my bag and placed an envelope on the table, sliding it toward the investigator without looking away from her. The paper whispered across the linen, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade. Every insult tonight, I thought, was fuel. Now I strike, not with words, but with proof. The investigator picked up the envelope, opened it carefully, and began to scan the pages inside. Documents, contracts, signatures, the fraudulent web laid bare. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, steady, deliberate. You told me I had no place in this house, I said, every syllable sharp as glass. Turns out, neither do you. The silence that followed was heavier than screams. For once, Corvina had no answer. Her empire crumbled before her family's eyes. She slammed her palm against the table. Lies, she shouted, her voice breaking. All of it, lies. Do you think I would— The investigator's voice cut through hers, colder than winter air. These records are not lies. Assets are frozen as of tonight. The estate is seized under federal authority. Her face twisted, desperation creeping through the cracks of her control. She stood abruptly, but her legs faltered beneath her. Sonara reached out a hand as though to steady her, but then withdrew, folding it tightly into her lap. Lazara sank lower into her chair, her smirk gone, her eyes wet with tears she wouldn't let fall. Alaric finally looked at me. For the first time that evening, he truly looked. Shame burned in his eyes, not for me, but for himself. For every moment he had chosen silence, for every chance to defend me that he had let slip away. Emmerich, his shoulders heavy, sank deeper into his chair. All of it, he whispered, built on lies. I straightened, my voice quiet, but carrying through the hall. Justice rarely arrives with thunder, I said. Sometimes it walks in with a file and erases everything in ink. Guests exchanged sharp whispers. Fraud. Money laundering. Seized. The humiliation spread faster than the evidence itself. What had begun as a family dinner was now a public downfall. And in their world, reputation was currency. Tonight, their accounts had been emptied. Corvina pounded the table again. "You dare do this to me? In my house?" The investigator didn't blink. "This house," he said, placing another document on the table, "is no longer yours." Sonara's painted lips trembled as she whispered, "Mother, what have you done?" Lazara buried her face in her hands. Even the guests who had once cheered Corvina now leaned away, unwilling to be caught in her shadow. I turned to leave my seat. No one dared stop me. The power dynamic had reversed entirely. They tried to bury me with silence, I thought. Instead, silence buried them. My gaze flicked briefly to Alaric. His silence now was his own prison, the bars built by years of loyalty to the wrong person. He would live with that, not me. In America, women are told often to endure quietly, to swallow words, to play small. But I knew now, silence isn't always endurance. Sometimes silence is strategy. "The most dangerous woman of all," I remembered a quote, "is the one who refuses to rely on your sword because she carries her own." I stepped away from the table, my movements measured. The hallway greeted me with its familiar echo, but it felt different now, emptier, freer. Laughter had once bounced off these walls. Tonight, only silence reigned. "They thought I had no voice," I whispered to myself. But tonight, silence roared louder than their cruelty. The red light of the security camera blinked above, recording the downfall, capturing every crack in the empire that had once looked untouchable. My future wasn't in that house, not in that family. It was in my resilience, in the quiet power they had mocked but never understood. As I opened the front door, the cool night air swept over me, cleansing, bracing. Behind me, the investigator's voice echoed as he finalized Corvina's ruin. For the first time in years, I was free.